All right, welcome to notes in regards to the transition of the civil rights movement. This would either be the second or the third part of the civil rights movement, depending on how many days it was taught originally. What we're going to focus on today is we're going to look at how the civil rights movement alters sort of from its original start, how you get different intentions that are not the peaceful state that you see with Dr. King. We will talk about Malcolm X. We'll talk about the rise of Black Power. And here is sort of the basic premise for this lecture. So when the civil rights movement starts, and if we want to be really specific, we'll say it starts during the World War II period with the double V, but really Montgomery bus boycott around there in the 1950s is when we get sort of when people refer to the civil rights movement, the actions that they are referring to with regards to voter registration, with the desegregation of schools, with the desegregation of Southern society in general. And so what we have is when the movement starts and the again the bias or the hypothesis or theory that I want to promote and that you'll see a lot of historians promote is that the movement starts, it is very much a Dr. King peaceful movement. It is, we're going to turn the other cheek. We're not going to respond. You can spit on us. You can throw food at us. You can put on the dogs and the fire hydrants and arrest us and beat us, et cetera, et cetera. And we are not going to react in a violent manner. It is always going to be peaceful, non-violent. Example of classic civil disobedience as taught by Gandhi is also talked about by Thoreau during Transcendentalism. And the idea sort of behind this was that if whites are saying that African Americans are the animals, that they're the second class citizens, and if that's the whites' belief, well, when you see the footage of how whites are reacting, one group of people is being completely compliant, that is being very respectful, very civilized, and that's the African Americans. They're not reacting violently. It's the whites that are violent. And it was the belief of Dr. King and others in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and other organizations, the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Coalition or Conference, that nonviolent would be the way to go, that it may take longer, but that it would be the most easily accepted by whites. Almost as if you're looking at the arguments of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois when we talk about early civil rights movements at the turn of the century, that Booker T takes a much calmer approach, a much less kind of freaking white people out with the idea of voter equality and that sort of thing. And interestingly enough, both Dr. King and Booker T are Southern men. Whereas when we get to people like Malcolm X, you've got someone that's living up north that might have a different perspective. So what you begin to see as the civil rights movement sort of goes on, definitely into the late 60s and the 70s, even though Malcolm X will be our exception because he is a contemporary of Dr. King. But there's this frustration with the progress with the civil rights movement. You see Dr. King address it in his letters from a Birmingham jail. This idea of why are things going so slow? Why is Brown versus the Board of Education passed in 1954, and by the 1970s, we still have schools that have not desegregated? Why are things not moving faster? And anytime people feel frustrated, that often turns to anger. When what you think is rightly owed you and what it is rightly owed you via the laws of humanity and common decency, constitutional requirements, when those things aren't given to you, people start to react the way that someone that is frustrated and angry acts, and it's often violent. And so the movement takes this peaceful turn to this more of where you're going to come at me with violence, I'm going to come right back at you with violence. We tried to do it the Dr. King way. You didn't seem to want to do it that way, particularly after Dr. King is assassinated in 68. The movement just says, fine, now you can deal with Black Panthers. Now you can deal with a more rebellious movement. So in 65, you get the Watts riots, which is a neighborhood in Los Angeles. They are race riots. You get the coming up of the Black Panthers, who quite frankly scare the bejesus out of white people. They are normally armed. They advocate the right to be armed. They often dress all in black. They wear the black leather. They wear the berets. And they are seen as, in the definition, would be a militant civil rights group. And they basically say, if you come at me with violence, I'm coming right back at you. But what's often overlooked is the amazing things that the Black Panthers do within the African American community. Very community oriented, from education to feeding those in poverty. They really promote good things within the African American community. They are also anti-Vietnam War. They do not believe that African Americans should have to go fight for a country that discriminates against them. That idea, Stokely Carmichael, who had been a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, begins promoting this idea of Black power. You really see the idea of Black power coming up in the Harlem Renaissance, the idea that I am Black and I am proud of who I am, and we are going to band together and make this happen, and this being civil rights. White people see this as more intimidating, more of something to be afraid of. They do not seem to view it as a reaction to restrictions placed on African Americans by white society, which is more or less what it is. Following the Watts riots, you get riots and race riots in Detroit as well. So Malcolm X, if you don't know what he looks like this. I often say in classes that I am a huge Malcolm X fan for a lot of reasons. He certainly has good and bad to him, like every other human being on the face of the planet. So he was, and I will say, if you ever get a chance to read the autobiography of Malcolm X or see the documentary Malcolm X that was put out in the 90s, definitely worth a read and worth a watch, although it is a long film. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little. He goes to jail at the age of 20 for burglary. There he studies the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. After about 6.5 years, he enters in 1942 as to serve 6.5 years. He gets drawn to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad from the Nation of Islam and the Black Muslims. I'm going to come back to them in a minute. He changes his name from Malcolm Little to Malcolm X. And the reason that he does that is he says the X stands for his unknown heritage, referring to the fact that many African Americans, their last name was related to the former slave owners, that slaves would have to take the name of the slave owner, that it often changed. It's sort of it's one of the reasons why after the Civil War you see freed slaves or newly freed slaves changing their names, their last names, to something else, to making something else entirely. Freeman or Freeman was a common change of last name. And so he just says the X represents my unknown heritage. You stole it from me. I don't know what it is. So now it's just going to be an X. He becomes a minister in the Nation of Islam in 52 after release from prison. And he becomes an adamant supporter of Elijah Muhammad and really preaching the ideas of Nation of Islam. One of the tenets, and a quite controversial tenet of the Nation of Islam, is that whites were the cause for the African American condition, and that African Americans should separate from white society. If you remembered in Harlem Renaissance, we talked about a gentleman named Marcus Garvey, who was the leader of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and mentioned that he had that idea of the Back to Africa movement, and that he would influence the Nation of Islam and later on people like Malcolm X. He advocates Black power. He advocates armed self-defense. He is not turning the other cheek. He is just fearful for a lot of white people. And in fact, it was almost the idea, well, if you don't want Martin Luther King Jr. and to do civil rights this way, then here's who we have in the corner. We have Malcolm X. I'm also going to post up on Edpuzzle a clip from a video that you need to watch. in regards to its from the Eyes on the Prize series in regards to Malcolm X, and it's definitely worth a look-see. So Nation of Islam, let's sort of talk about them briefly. You probably are not familiar with them, or maybe you are. They are not Islam, as in one of the 5 major world religions, Islam. The Nation of Islam was founded as an African-American and political religious movement. It was founded in Detroit by a guy named Wallace D. Fard Muhammad in 1930. Their official goals are to improve spiritual, mental, social, and economic conditions of African Americans in the United States and in all humanity. In 34, Fard is replaced by Elijah Muhammad. He begins setting up different types of worship centers within the Detroit area, and that does spread. Their main belief is that there is no other God but Allah, that their founder, Fard Muhammad, is the Mahdi. Their beliefs have been outlined in a number of articles and documents, and through people like Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, modern-day Louis Farrakhan, and Muhammad's teachings were written in a book called Message to the Black Man in America. Their teachings on race and also their anti-Semitism are quite controversial. They believe that it's referred to as white devils, that the white society essentially was created separate, that black people were the original peoples of the earth, that whites were created separately, that they were a plague upon the earth, that they sought to constantly take down the white man, and that is the goal of white society, that all the problems within particularly American society for black people is the fault of whites, that they have done this, that whites fear an educated, empowered African American population because they do not want their power to be replaced. They do have anti-Semitic beliefs, which again I said are controversial. Their basic tenets, they do follow the 5 pillars of Islam: the belief in one God, the praying 5 times a day, fasting during Ramadan, giving to the poor, and then the pilgrimage to Mecca. They do differ somewhat from Islam in that they teach that their founder, Fard Muhammad, was the Messiah of the Jews and the Mahdi of the Muslims. Traditional Muslims are still waiting for the Mahdi, or Mahdi, so I hope I'm not pronouncing it wrong. And of course, the Jewish population is still waiting for their Messiah. They believe that Muhammad was the last prophet of Allah, being that they're not Muhammad, founder of Islam Muhammad, but Fard Muhammad was the last prophet. So that is a difference as well. They preach about this guy, Jacob, which connects the idea of the white people being deviled. They also do read the Quran and hold parts of the Quran. So there's some similarities. There's also some strong differences. I am not aware of a Nation of Islam temple here in Washington, but there is one in Greenville. They publish materials all the time, newspapers, etc., in which if they would sell it to you, you could read and see what they were up to within the community. They do a lot of sort of within the African American community enrichment and promotion of good deeds. So here's the thing. There is a separation of values at one point between Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad. They go their own separate ways. Malcolm X himself goes on the required once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage to Mecca, as required in both the Nation of Islam and people of the Islamic faith. And while he's there, he sees people of every different skin pigmentation, all different ethnicities, all worshiping Allah or God together. And he has this epic change of heart. And basically, he realizes that it's possible for different races to get along and come to some sort of compromise. So when he comes back, he begins sort of preaching his own thing and forms a separate group, separate of the Nation of Islam, which makes Elijah Muhammad and the members of the Nation of Islam very, very, very angry. Malcolm X gives several speeches. Most of his speeches are very, very long. One of his famous ones is called the bullet or ballot speech, in which he says, well, if you and I don't use the ballot, we're going to be forced to use the bullet, so let's try the ballot. And he begins preaching and promoting more of a unity attempt. This angers members in the Nation of Islam, and he is assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam in Harlem, New York, February 21st, 1965. The death of Martin Luther King Jr., April 1968, at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. This is the same motel that Dr. King always stayed at. He happened to be in town supporting striking sanitation workers. He was shot while standing on the balcony of a hotel by a man with the wonderful name of James Earl Ray. James Earl Ray was eventually captured in London's Heathrow Airport in June of 1968. He takes a plea deal. He receives a 99-year prison term. In 1977, he and 7 others escape prison, and then they're caught 3 days later. He does begin making claims that there was more to the death of Dr. King than just a white guy that was racist. And there are claims of the FBI being involved. He has several meetings with the King family, and whatever it is that he said to the King family does convince the King family, who advocates for another trial. They want him retried, almost as if he would have, like, they want him to get an appeal, for him to go back to trial and to see if there is new evidence that would present some sort of conspiracy. We know the FBI was tailing Dr. King, and it is possible that, sort of like the JFK assassination, that there is much more to the story. Unfortunately for Ray, he dies in prison in 1998 as a result of kidney disease. The King family, again, they still do support the idea of a conspiracy. There's a link to a YouTube video when you print out the notes. Definitely take a look at it. These were just quotes from Malcolm X. So the legacy of the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Act is passed in 1968. That's the Civil Rights Act of 68. There's also the Civil Rights Act of 64. The Civil Rights Act of 68 ends discrimination in housing. Affirmative action is probably by far the most controversial law to come out of the Civil Rights Movement, and this is just an overall effort to increase in not only hiring for jobs but also for college those populations that had previously been discriminated against, and this would be all different minorities, including women. There is some that claim in the 60s and 70s, and you hear more today, that there's this issue of reverse discrimination, that we have made such an effort to include everyone that white males are no longer getting a fair shot anymore, and that they are being overlooked for minorities, and that's definitely a debate and a discussion that will continue to go on. So what you want to look at is the change of the Civil Rights Movement, that it goes from peaceful to more violent, why it gets that way. The Civil Rights Movement is obviously something that one might say peaks in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but it is not something that has gone away. The NAACP is still extremely active. There's still massive cases of discrimination. You could make the synthesis with the Black Lives Matter campaign that is now out. You could talk about Moral Monday marches here in North Carolina at the Capitol. So it is something that a struggle that continues for a lot of different reasons, and you begin to see, and we will talk about this separately, that the Civil Rights Movement, the African American Civil Rights Movement, inspires other groups in the 60s and 70s, from women to Hispanics to Native Americans, to see that change is possible, that African Americans are getting change. Voter registration is going up. Jim Crow is abolished. And so these other groups are inspired, and they begin in the 60s and 70s seeking change as well. And the pendulum, if we're going to go from, if the pendulum was in the middle, we would be at complete moderate views. you go to the right, you go to the left. And for the 60s and 70s, you have the pendulum of sort of the American political front and psyche swinging very far to the left. And that will have effects as we usher in the Reagan era in the 1980s. That is where I leave you for this somewhat not so brief look at the end of the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s.